Welcome to Unit 1. In this unit, we are in many ways considering the origins of American education or thinking about American education as we wrestle with this question of the relationship between schooling and educational systems and what we might call the American project. So, what is the American project? Certainly, a lot of narratives come to mind, and we might call these dominant narratives. I introduced that idea last week, right? Majoritarian or dominant narratives, the common narratives about our history, include things like manifest destiny and expanding opportunity, expanding freedom and equality, the idea of the city on the hill, that the United States, from its inception, has been destined to become a beacon of light for the world in regards to democracy, in regards to individual freedom and liberty, that it is the first in these areas and that it continues to be the best. We might describe that as the American project. That's what majoritarian dominant narratives describe, right? But there's more to the American project than this. There is, for example, the idea of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a specific kind of colonialism that sought not to simply come to a land and take resources, but to instead replace indigenous populations with new settler populations. So the United States, Canada, Australia, these are all settler colonial nations where those who colonized came and stayed, and they wanted to take over the land and make the land their own. Side by side with settler colonialism, we have an idea of extractive capitalism. The idea, it's a form of capitalism that's based on the extraction of profit from humans and from nature. And we see this, of course, in systems of slavery in the United States. From before it was a nation, from the earliest colonies, through slavery into Jim Crow era, right? Arguably continuing today. So we have, if we go back in time, right, we have the American project and the dominant narratives, which we can argue about whether these dominant narratives are true, but these are certainly the narratives that are shared. What's often not talked about in the American project are settler colonialism and extractive capitalism. But those have been part of America from the beginning, right? And we're going to look at that in this unit. Okay, so if we're considering how schooling fits into this idea of an American project, I want us to consider both the dominant narratives and these other undercurrents or counter narratives about colonialism, about extraction, right? And how those are playing out through schooling. So before we look at schooling specifically, I'm going to remind us of this quote that is in D2L. And if you have seen Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, you'll recognize it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. So she's a Nigerian writer and novelist. And in her TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, she asks us to think about the power of storytelling. And specifically, one of the arguments she makes is that where we start a story matters, and it's an assertion of power. She tells us that power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with, secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story. So what we're going to consider is where should we start the story of American education, and how does that starting point connect to ideas of the American project, whether those are the majoritarian narratives or the undercurrents of settler colonialism and extractive capitalism. So where should we start the story? Here's where we often start, right? When we think about American history, we often start here at what is considered the formal birth of the United States, and it's no different when we talk about education. So, in the late 1700s, we encounter a story of rebellion of British colonists against King George, against taxation without representation, against different forms of power being exerted from the British throne over the colonists. Thomas Jefferson, who I'm sure we're all familiar with, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Thomas Jefferson, but he in many ways is often accredited not only with being a founding father of the United States, but a founding father of the ideals of education in the United States. And so you read in this unit the Bill for the General Diffusion of Knowledge right here, right? He first introduces this bill in 1778 to the Virginia legislature and it continues to be introduced even after he is not in the legislature until some form of schooling is passed in Virginia in 1796. So here, and then often when we talk about schooling, if we zoom ahead a little bit on this timeline, we encounter someone named Horace Mann, who is often considered the grandfather of public schooling in the United States. So I just want you to see this timeline, right? We often start here in the late 1700s when we talk about American history in general, and when we think about the philosophy of education in the US, right, with the ideas of Thomas Jefferson, as well as a few decades later, when Horace Mann became Secretary of Education in Massachusetts and began advocating for common schools and normal schools being teacher training grounds, public normal schools for teachers. So Thomas Jefferson and Horace Mann are often considered the origins of American educational ideals, our philosophies about what schooling should be in a democratic society. Thomas Jefferson specifically is seen as, in an American context, the thinker most aligned with the ideas of democratic education. And there's two parts to democratic education, right? There is the idea that it is in schools that students learn the knowledge, skills, and dispositions to become democratic citizens. So Thomas Jefferson wanted citizens who could read, or a certain subset of citizens who could read and who could think critically, and who were in tune with classical ideas in order to effectively be members of governance, right? To be members of the ruling class. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as we read the Bill for the General Diffusion of Knowledge, did not think that this was necessary for everyone. And in fact, he wanted to call from the large swaths of American citizens who were poor, who were middle class. He wanted to find and sift out the genius from the garbage, or the genius from the rubbish, as he says, and pull or elevate those people into the governing class. So that's one idea of democratic education. Another, which you may be familiar with through the work of John Dewey, who comes much later, and who we're not really spending much time on, or any time at all really, in this course, because he's someone that you learn about significantly in your philosophy courses and in your human development courses. But John Dewey's ideas of democratic education really centered around the school itself as a democratic space, that it was in school that students come to practice being democratic citizens. And John Dewey's ideas were built really off the ideas both of Thomas Jefferson, but also Horace Mann, who in the early to mid 1800s became the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and Horace Mann became a staunch advocate for what we call common schools. And his idea was that schools, if we want a democracy, right, and if in a democracy we need people to forge relationships and ideas and self-governance across lines of difference, then we need people to practice coming together across lines of difference and to have a shared identity, right, as Americans. And so for Horace Mann, he believed that schools were the place where this should happen. He believed in tax-funded public schools, elementary primarily, where children of all classes, where children of all different kinds of laborers would come together to forge community and to become American citizens together. So if we pause here, and you read two primary documents by them, right? You read Jefferson's original bill on the diffusion of knowledge, and you read Horace Mann's speech on the importance of education in a Republican government. These are often where we start the story of American education, as you see in the PBS documentary that we watched the beginning of, right? This is where we start the narrative. The question is this where we should start the narrative? Because although TJ and Horace Mann were advocating for democracy and common schools, they didn't really mean for everyone. Who was included in these ideals? Were women included? No. Were Indians included? No. Indigenous people, right? No. Were enslaved and free Black Americans included? No, they were not. So these ideas of democratic education and of common school education were not for everyone living on the land that is the United States. It was for a specific subset. It was for white men, right? And the question becomes, if we're thinking about the American project, was that exclusion of other groups of people, was that exclusion an aberration? Or was that part and parcel of what the American project is? You should see these questions reflected today in curricular questions, right? The struggles over critical race theory and anti-racist teaching are really struggles over this. Are we going to say that exclusion and racism in the past was an aberration? Or are we going to say that it is at the heart of our identity as Americans and the American project? So let's return back to this timeline. We can see that education has a role before Thomas Jefferson starts talking about it, and it's often in a negative role. So one story that comes up in our reading is around the anti-literacy laws in the slave codes throughout the colonies. So in 1739, there was a rebellion in South Carolina that caused the South Carolina legislature to enact a far more restrictive slave code. It's referred to as the Negro Act of 1740, in which literacy was criminalized for enslaved African Americans. Right? Literacy, if you were caught teaching someone who was enslaved to read or write, you faced a fine. And those who were enslaved who were caught reading or writing or trying to learn reading or writing, where it was encouraged, they were punished brutally, including being killed for the act of learning to read and write. So how does this fit? This certainly on a timeline comes before Thomas Jefferson. Is this where we should start our conversation about education in the United States and what it means in the American project, in understanding that education is a space of power and therefore should only be accessible to a select few? If we go farther back in time to 1636, and actually let's start here. So let's go all the way back. Let's go back to the founding of Jamestown, 1607. We move just a little bit forward. 1619, we have the first enslaved people arriving on the shores of what is now the United States. Of course, the first enslaved people arrived in the New World in 1502 in Latin America, in what is now Latin America, South America. But in 1619, on the shores of Virginia, a boatload of the first enslaved Africans arrived. Shortly thereafter, Plymouth Colony was founded, right? So this is a short timeline that we're looking at. Let's move forward just a little bit. So Plymouth is founded in 1620. There are enslaved people in what is now the United States at that point. And in 1636, Harvard College is founded. It's the first university in what is now the United States. And Wilder, in his chapter from the book Ebony and Ivy that we read, really asks us to wrestle with, what does that mean? What does it mean that these universities were founded at a time when extractive capitalism and settler colonialism were seen as God's will for the people that were here and for the establishment of colonies here in what is now the United States? He shows us in detail how Harvard College, how the College of William and Mary, how other colleges at this time, these earliest institutions, were part and parcel of the missionary work of the colonists in terms of civilizing the native people that were here, and that they were able to fund their work through slave labor, through the labor of enslaved people, by extracting profit from people, right? Do we start the story of American education here? And if so, how does that change the story? Now, we could keep moving forward just a little bit to 1655, when Harvard College established what was called the Indian College at Harvard College, which was a free education for any Native people in an attempt to evangelize, to share and spread Christianity, and to teach English and Latin, right? To teach the civilized, quote, civilized ways of the colonists to Indians. What happens if we start our story here with Harvard College, including the Indian College at Harvard University? How does the story change then? The Indian College did not last as long as Harvard University, certainly. Let's keep going. Thought I had another date here, but I don't. In there, we have stories about King Philip's War and the Pequot massacres, and so this brutal military fighting that was happening simultaneous to the Indian College at Harvard to both militarily dominate the Native people that were here, and then those who were not dominated to civilize them, a both and. We'll see that theme echoed next in our next unit, Unit 2, and again, it raises the question, what happens if we start the story of American education there? We can keep going, of course, because after the Bill for the General Diffusion of Knowledge, we see, for example, people already speaking up shortly thereafter, before public education even becomes a thing, to be more inclusive. Should it include women? We see the establishment of seminaries, right? As Horace Mann is arguing for common schools that are not completely common, we see continued struggles over the education of African Americans, including free African Americans, in what is now the United States. So Nat Turner's rebellion, another rebellion among enslaved people, leads to more restrictive laws throughout the South. And very close in time to that, so 1831, we have, in 1833, Oberlin College, the first integrated university, opens. It opens accepting African Americans. We see the establishment around this time of the Canterbury Female Seminary. It only existed for a year, but it was an all African American female seminary or schooling. At the same time that the Canterbury Female Seminary is founded, Connecticut passes its own black laws, which are reminiscent of the 1740 Negro Act in South Carolina, outlawing education for those who are enslaved. All of this is going on contemporarily with Horace Mann's work. Does he talk about this? Simultaneously, towards the later end, through the seminary movement, restrictive laws, Horace Mann talking about common schools, we also have, in the last article that we read by Baumgartner, this discussion of the seminary movement and the exclusion of African American women from the seminary movement. And in the article, the author talks about Rosetta Douglass, Frederick Douglass's daughter, being admitted but not allowed to participate as a full citizen or student in the life of the seminary. And when we see these dates next to each other, right, when we see that Horace Mann is speaking in, that he begins in the late, let's get his dates. Will it show us his dates? Here we go. 1837 to 1848. Well, that's happening. So are these arguments over whether or not African Americans should be included in schooling. So when we think about democratic education, common schools, we can often think of that as the poetry about American education, right? And that poetry matters. There was a reason that African Americans who were enslaved were struggling for literacy, right? Struggling to read and to write and to tell their own stories, to plan rebellions, to be fully human through reading and writing, because education offers a pathway towards liberation. We've always known that. Some would argue that that is why it was limited to those who were in power. But we see this theme of education for liberation popping up in American educational history and struggles for literacy. In specifically and related to Indian education, in Wilder's piece, we hear stories of Indigenous people who used their Harvard education and their training in English to rebel and to fight back and to assert their own sovereignty and personhood. We see it in slave narratives. People like Frederick Douglass telling his own story when he escaped bondage, came to the North to claim his right to being a free human being, his ability to tell his own story and to tell the world about what he endured became essential for the fight for liberation. And for abolitionist movements. Another piece by Baumgartner, which is in the recommended reading. So these are just for your own, if you want to know more, these are great places to look, right? I don't expect that you're reading them. But in our other piece on Ohio, we learn about how abolitionists were adamant. There were different strands of abolition, but some abolitionists were adamant that education offered a path for racial equality, that it wasn't enough to abolish slavery, that we must do everything in our power to make sure, since there is no constitutional, not as in the law, but as by birth, right? There is no constitutional inferiority, some abolitionists argued, and thus education would help to end racial prejudice and show equality between the races and allow African Americans to claim full citizenship, their full birthright as citizens. So education became essential to abolition work. Many of those who were involved in abolition work were white women, and although their involvement was problematic, and that's topic for another course, their own ability to be involved in abolition was indebted to their own education, to women's private literary societies, their attendance at seminaries, women's seminaries, their ability to be educated enabled them to participate in the abolition movement. And the abolition movement itself was indebted to those who had endured slavery and came and told their stories, right? Literacy at the core of it. Of course, education also led to other ways of claiming one's citizenship. Some women, particularly white women, but some white women were not at all concerned with abolition, but they were concerned with their own role as citizens, and made claims around the idea of Republican motherhood, that it was the woman's job in the domestic sphere to educate the next generation of citizens. And that required that a woman herself be educated. And so we can see how education repeatedly from our founding educational narratives, there are democratic ideas that we attribute to people like Thomas Jefferson and Horace Mann, but that running along parallel to them are all these struggles of other everyday people who did not have access to the ideals and the enactment that Mann and Jefferson were putting forward, but who claimed it as their right and used what they claimed on a path for liberation.